Moving to a small, isolated village was supposed to be a peaceful escape from city life. After years of noise and crowds, the idea of settling in a place where everyone knew each other felt almost comforting. But as the weeks passed, I started to notice things that didn't quite add up. The villagers were friendly enough, but there was something unsettling about how they moved, almost as if they shared a silent understanding. They spoke of the upcoming harvest festival with a reverence I hadn't seen before. I was curious, but every time I asked about it, they would only smile and tell me to wait and see. One night, I overheard a conversation between two villagers outside my window. Their voices were low, but I caught bits and pieces: the pact, the sacrifice, and outsiders can't know. My stomach turned. I couldn't shake the feeling that this festival was more than just a celebration of crops. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached Mr. Albrecht, the village elder, hoping to get some answers. He was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through you. When I mentioned the harvest festival, his expression darkened, and he muttered that the prosperity of the village depends on honoring our ancestors' traditions. His words were vague, but his tone was sharp, leaving no room for more questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing fragments of what I'd overheard, whispers of a pact, and words that hinted at something dark. Around midnight, I looked out my window and saw a line of villagers walking silently toward the woods, lanterns in hand, their faces pale and empty. My heart pounded as I realized they were heading toward the edge of the forest, where I'd heard rumors of an ancient, forbidden altar. I knew I shouldn't follow, but a dark pull within me left me no choice. I kept my distance, hiding among the trees as I followed the procession. The villagers walked with a purpose, their lanterns casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and dance as they moved deeper into the forest. I fought the urge to turn back, but curiosity and dread pushed me forward. After several minutes, we arrived at a clearing I'd never seen before, dominated by a massive stone altar slick with something dark and wet. I squinted, realizing with horror that the stone was stained, freshly so. The villagers formed a circle around the altar, their faces obscured in shadow. Mr. Albrecht stood at the center, holding a ceremonial blade, its edge gleaming with dark residue. His eyes were wide, unblinking, as he began to chant, his voice a low, guttural growl that sent chills through my bones. The villagers echoed his words, their voices blending into a terrifying, haunting melody that filled the night air. Then, two villagers dragged a sack to the altar, its contents thrashing violently. I heard muffled cries from within, and I realized with horror that it wasn't an animal, it was a person. My stomach turned as Mr. Albrecht raised the blade, reciting a twisted prayer. In one swift motion, he plunged the knife into the sack, silencing the screams. Blood spilled across the stone, pooling at its base. The villagers didn't flinch, in fact, they seemed entranced, their eyes locked on the altar, expressions blank yet hungry. I backed away, heart pounding, but my foot snapped a branch. The chanting stopped instantly, and all heads turned toward me, their eyes cold and furious. Mr. Albrecht's voice sliced through the silence, filled with venom as he said, "The pact must be honored. No one breaks the bond." I turned and ran, the sounds of footsteps and whispers growing louder behind me. The woods felt endless, every shadow twisting into the face of a villager ready to drag me back. I barely made it back to my house, slamming the door shut and locking it. My mind was racing, my breath ragged. I knew I couldn't stay here, not after what I'd seen. But before I could pack my things, a loud knock echoed from the door. I froze. Through the peephole, I saw Mr. Albrecht, his eyes blazing with anger, flanked by several villagers holding their lanterns low, casting long shadows across their faces. "You broke the silence," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "The pact demands secrecy. You have brought ruin upon yourself." I tried to reason with them, insisting I wouldn't tell anyone, that I'd leave the village immediately. But Mr. Albrecht shook his head. "You are part of the ritual now. The blood bond has been breached. It must be fulfilled." They forced the door open, hands reaching out to grab me. I fought against them, but they were strong, their faces expressionless, as if they were puppets bound by a force far older and darker than any of us. They dragged me back to the forest, where the altar stood waiting, still slick with blood. I begged, pleaded, but my cries fell on deaf ears. As they forced me onto the stone, Mr. Albrecht's cold eyes met mine. "The spirits demand a soul for every broken vow," he whispered, raising the blade high. I knew there was no escape. I felt the cold of the altar seep into my skin, and the chanting began again, filling the forest with a terrible, guttural melody. The last thing I saw was Mr. Albrecht's twisted smile, and then, everything went dark. In the days that followed, the villagers whispered of a newcomer who had vanished, another soul taken by the pact. The harvest festival continued as planned, the villagers smiling and celebrating as if nothing had happened. And the altar in the woods waited, silent and cold, ready for the next stranger who would stumble into the village, unaware of the fate that awaited them.